Welcome to another episode of the Snap Fantasy Football Podcast, your weekly dose of news and advice that comes to your pocket every single Saturday. Holding it down, here we got Mac, Mark, Scott, and Landon. Enjoy today's show. Hey, welcome back to the Snap Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mac, joined by the whole crew, Landon, Mark, and Scotty. Look, welcome to wide receiver week. Now, last week, if you didn't see our series of videos, we did a couple videos on some running backs. Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, Nick Chubb, and Kareem Hunt, that duo there in Cleveland, to name a few. This week, we're focused on wide receiver, and we've got a good one for you today. It is wide receiver week as well as hat week. I think some of us are currently missing the barbershop. So we're going to keep it nice and clean here with some lids for you. Look, get us on Instagram and Twitter at snap_fantasy if you want to stay in touch with the show, especially going into next week with the NFL draft coming up. But we're talking about Brandin Cooks. Fresh off his deal with the Texans, heading away from LA, joining Deshaun Watson, and now David Johnson in Houston. Can Brandin Cooks be relevant for fantasy, live back up to that New England level that he was playing at a couple seasons ago after a down year in LA? The answer for me is yes, he can. Some people are going to be questioning his ability, especially coming off a couple different concussions and other injuries. I think Brandin Cooks has a massive opportunity here. And I'll kick it to Mark here in a second because he's sort of going to piggyback on what I'm saying. But when Brandin Cooks was in Los Angeles, he had elite level talent to contend with. He had Cooper Kupp in his ascension heading into his prime. He had Robert Woods, another player that was developing and taking away targets. He had one of the best running backs of the last 5 years in Todd Gurley coming out of the backfield, stealing 80 to 100 targets a year. So he finds himself now in an offense where he is definitely the wide receiver one, and he goes from a 21% target share in LA to filling maybe DeAndre Hopkins' 34% target share vacancy. There's certainly opportunity, and if the narrative on Brandin Cooks stays negative and low and that hype doesn't supersede what he can actually give you, I think there's a tremendous amount of value in Brandin Cooks. Mark, I think this is your point to sort of jump in and build on this case that we're going to build.
Yeah, so just looking at the landscape right now, the Texans and Bill O'Brien are catching a lot of flack over this trade, between losing Hopkins, between picking up Brandin Cooks as an attempt to replace him with his known concussion history, losing a second-round draft pick in all this process, whereby he could have drafted a top talent wide receiver. The Texans aren't catching a break right now, and some of the criticism is deserved. But I am not a Brandin Cooks hater. I think he's an extremely talented player. And another brush stroke that is painting Brandin Cooks right now is that he's being traded away from teams because of a bad attitude or because he doesn't have a good locker room presence or doesn't have the skill. But it's not actually that. He has been traded now 3 times. He's 27 years old. That is a record that stands since Eric Dickerson in 1980. So we all remember his superstar performances, but we're looking at something unique here. It's not because of his bad attitude or anything like that. It's just kind of a circumstance. Each time that he's been moved, it's because that's what the team who held him needed to do, and it just seems like it seems like he is to blame, but it's not that. And he has been very successful the majority of seasons he's played in this league. Last year, obviously, a down year. So we're looking at him right now. People are down on him. And let me give you this little take real quick. I think there's a chance that Brandin Cooks could have an explosive season. They now have David Johnson. He is a super talented running back, and they also graded up on one of the best left tackles in the league last year with Laramie Tunsil. So if you put DJ behind that, you got to get that momentum rolling. I think there's a good chance of that. And then that opens up a lot more opportunities for those receivers when it makes defenses plan for more than just one-dimensional offense. It's not just going to be limited to one big guy to cover all the time. I think Cooks is going to be open a lot of the time, and defenses are going to have their hands full trying to manage the threats on this Houston offense. So for me, I think he is a lot more skilled than his ADP would lead you to believe, and I would take a chance on Brandin Cooks this year, despite the climate around him right now. So Landon, I'd like to hear what you have to say on the whole matter.
Thanks, Mark. I would think I'm somewhere in the middle here. I understand the upside of Brandin Cooks, and we don't play fantasy football to lose. We play to win. And definitely, Brandin Cooks has that upside. We've seen it before. He's had 4 consecutive seasons after his rookie year of being a 1,000-yard receiver. He's had elite quarterbacks throwing in the ball, and this doesn't stop here with Deshaun Watson. Now, one thing about Deshaun Watson is he's always had a big wide receiver to throw out. I understand that Hopkins was only about 6'1", but even going back to Clemson, he had Mike Williams, a big-bodied wide receiver. Brandin Cooks is only 5'10". For him to be his quote-unquote number one go-to guy, it's going to be a little bit of a drop going from a big-bodied, obviously the big catch radius that Hopkins has, to a guy like Brandin Cooks, maybe a quick guy. Will Fuller is kind of similar to him, a deep threat, 6-foot wide receiver, and they kind of already have that. So it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what part of the field Brandin Cooks occupies. One thing I will say is what this time of year, this climate, it's going to be hard for players to change teams and adapt to their systems. There's a few players that we're going to talk about that are going to be changing systems, and with the COVID problem and everything, it's gonna be harder to spend time with your quarterback and learn about the system. It might be virtually. Even though if we start the season on time, it's gonna be a little bit of a learning curve for players to learn systems kind of away from the actual facility. One thing right now, if you're gonna be buying Brandin Cooks in Dynasty, I think it's a great time to buy. The narrative around Houston is at such a low point. You've seen such elite talents like Watson, Hopkins, Watts, Clowney, all kind of bring the Houston Texans to an elite level where low-key the organization has been run extremely poorly. We've seen this, the criticism of Bill O'Brien in recent weeks. So right now, I think if you're selling him, I would hang on to him. Hang on until the ADP starts rising. And Scotty, he's going in the mid-7th round, and you're expecting that to rise. What are your thoughts on Brandin Cooks?
I'm going to be the bad guy and just throw a straight-up wet blanket over the whole discussion of the reemergence of Brandin Cook. I understand he's going at 704 right now, but I think the way humans work, by the time it's actually draft day in the fantasy world, I actually think this number is going to be much higher. I think everyone loves the narrative of the unknown. And I was having a discussion, off camera where I was saying if Brandin Cooks hadn't been traded, we wouldn't even really be talking about him. He would have been just taken much later than the 7th round as kind of an afterthought. I'd say almost a desperation play at a tier break for wide receivers. The man has had 5 concussions over 6 seasons. Now, as someone who proudly owned Jordan Reed for many years in a row and kept saying, I know he had a concussion last year, but they say he's feeling good and it's going to be a great year, I'm drafting him again. As a guy who did that for year after year, I will not invest in players that have that many concussions. 5 is too many, in my opinion. As you said, he's 5'10". He's a fast guy, but he's supposed to be the go-to wide receiver in this offense. You're talking about the market share he's going to pick up with Hopkins being gone. I honestly don't believe he can take the abuse that will bring. Like a bell cow back, you have to have the frame and the healthy brain, we will say, to take the hits in the middle of the field, the outside, everywhere. It's the same type of grind for a number one wide receiver. And I honestly don't think that Brandin Cooks can keep it up for a whole season. So I think his ADP is going to go up as the excitement grows about a new relationship with Watson in a new landing spot. And you know what? He might get you a good week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But when that small, soft hit happens and you see his neck just twitch the wrong way, you're going to get caught in the rest of the season as not even cuttable, but the week-to-week checking injury reports all the way up to Saturday, Sunday morning, because they won't be sure, and then you're down a roster spot when they inevitably say he's out for the game. So save yourself the hassle. Don't grab the literally active grenade and think that the 5'10" no-show last season is going to emerge as a top 5 wide receiver in the league. Mac?
That's a good point, Scotty.
Well, those are good points. Just food for thought for the closing. I don't disagree with Scott. There are certainly some injury concerns, and those aren't things that we should neglect to acknowledge, but they are, every single player has some sort of injury history. All athletes do, some more severe than others. A couple closing remarks from me and the Brandin Cooks supporters. This is a 26-year-old receiver who, yes, has had some health issues. However, in New Orleans, wide receiver 14, wide receiver 9 with Drew Brees. In New England, 2017, finished as wide receiver 12. First year in LA, wide receiver 13. Every single team that Brandin Cooks has found himself on, he has recorded over 1,000 yards receiving, as well as saw well over 100 targets. I think the upper end in New Orleans was 129. So Brandin Cooks has seen the volume every single place he's gone, so don't discredit him from bouncing around. He's been productive, and he's been a fringe wide receiver 1/2 for the majority of his career. Last year, finishing wide receiver 62. That's an outlier for Brandin Cooks. Yeah, he had some health concerns. Jared Goff had a down year. The Rams were kind of a tire fire for a fantasy perspective with, Todd Gurley not living up to expectations and not making as many trips to the red zone, having a losing season. Give Brandin Cooks a pass. If he continues to fall, I think there's a tremendous amount of value. If he rises, I think the price is warranted. He should be the guy in Houston. So take it what you will. I think Scott provides some good points. I think the support for Brandin Cooks is also pretty strong. So let us know what you thought. Comments below. Where would you take Brandin Cooks if you had to draft right now? Are you targeting him? Please put us in the comment section below. Like and subscribe as always, and keep your eyes out for our other wide receiver videos. I think we're talking about Juju Smith-Schuster in the next one, so stay tuned. We'll see you later.